So we have to use these?
Yes, you have an option here or there.
Yeah. So I'm inviting Veronique, right?
Okay. Mic check. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. And thank you so much for being here. My name is Veronique Liverpool, and I am the president of the Escp Europe MBA Student Association. I'm also a current alumni of Escp Europe. I just want to say welcome to France, welcome to Escp Europe, and welcome to GBC 19, the first time it's ever been hosted in France. A couple of things you should know about our school is that we were actually the first ever business school. We were founded in 1819, over 200 years ago. We also are one of the only pan-European universities with 5 campuses across 5 countries under one roof, I guess you can say. It's for that reason that we chose the theme, United in Diversity, which is also the motto of the European Union. We wanted to focus on diversity in all of its different forms, be it cultural, gender, racial. And it's for that reason that we chose this theme. Anna?
And we're very excited to host the Graduate Business Conference because last year Veronique and I had the privilege of attending in Copenhagen. So we were very inspired and we decided to bring it home to Escp Europe, to our business school, and to show you what France has to offer and what else Europe has to offer with our 6 campuses, which Leon will expand about a bit later. So we're very privileged to have our Graduate Business Forum members here, all of you from business schools across the world, so it's a great networking opportunity. It's also a privilege to have you at our business school. Our MBA program is only 2 years old, so it's even despite the fact that ESCP Europe is one of the oldest business schools in the world, our MBA program is one of the newest ones in the world. So that's why we are very happy to have you here to discover our program, to discover what the school has to offer, and for all the networking opportunities you have between yourselves. So without further ado, I would like to welcome to the stage Whitaker Dupin, who is the CEO of the Graduate Business Forum. Thank you.
Dear Escp Europe leadership, dear Kenneth Cukier, keynote speaker, and dear GBC delegates and alumni, my name is Whitaker. I'm the CEO of the Graduate Business Forum, and the GBF is a global educational non-profit. We're led by former student leaders. I myself, for example, an alumni from MSM Erasmus University and ESADE. I was a student association president in 2004-2006, and today we also have the honor to have with us our founder, Jim DeVoe, with his lovely, of course, an applause. With his lovely partner, Kirsten. Jim founded the Graduate Business Forum in 1983, when he was Student Association President at Columbia Business School in New York. He has missed very few conferences since, so whenever you want to get a true feel of what the GBF is all about, he can give stories going back for over 35 years and GBF mottos, such as friendship needs nor place nor distance. One of the first things I learned from Jim coming to my first GBC. Today, it's my pleasure to be here with you at the campus of one of our newest members in the global network of student leaders from the top MBA programs and business schools in the world, Escp Europe. As Anna already reflected, Escp Europe is the oldest business school in our network, but it has the youngest MBA. Only 1.5 years ago, I was introduced by the Associate Dean of the Chinese University of Hong Kong to Pascal Martin, MBA Program Director at Escp Europe. She was telling me that this school was something special. They were highly ranked in all of their programs, and they had just built this new MBA who was expected to join these ranks very fast the moment they started to be ranked. So we're here now today, and they came last year to the conference themselves together with 3 of their students. We had a fantastic time in Copenhagen, thanks to our Copenhagen Business School organizers, of which some of them are here in the room. And not long after, we received a fantastic bid from the Escp Europe team to host GBC 2019, and we couldn't refuse to come here. The rest is history. Veronique and Anna, together with the leadership at the school and a great volunteer team of their peers, have done an amazing job to bring this conference to life. Much thought has been going in setting up the theme, the program, arranging the speakers, and in ensuring you will have an absolutely amazing time. The conference is optimized to become inspired, to network, to learn from leadership best practices from around the world, from each other, and from renowned leaders in the world. The hope is this will support you as individuals to be even more effective leaders, as student leaders, and to create positive change back at your school, and as alumni, to be powerful and audacious changemakers in business and society. The world of today, as we probably all agree, needs audacious leaders. And the young generation can really make a difference, as you've seen. Let me close off with some acknowledgement to Leon Larussa, Dean of Escp Europe, Veronique Tran, Maria Kutsovolu, Pascal, Martin Saint-Etienne, and of course our conference co-chairs, Veronique and Anna, and their whole team for their audacious leadership in hosting this year's conference. As you will see in the next few days, you're in for a great experience. I wish you a great conference, and I hope to speak and meet with you at this conference or on future ones, where you also will be welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrike. And we would like to welcome to the stage Leon Larussa, who is our Executive Vice President and Dean for Academic and International Affairs. Welcome, Leon.
Good morning. Dear, on behalf of our community, we sincerely welcome you to Escp Europe. We are very proud to host this 36th annual Global Business Conference at the World First Business School. I would like to start by thanking the wonderful team of organizers, the Global Business Forum, Whitaker, James, for their incredible support, our MBA graduates, Veronique, Anna, Oliver, for their tireless commitments to these organizations, my colleagues, Maria, Pascal, for their leadership, everyone, volunteers who participate in the organization and logistics. Last but not least, our many prestigious speakers and sponsors for helping make this even greater. As Veronique mentioned, we are celebrating our bicentennial of Escp Europe, and I want to share with you our values and missions, which you will discover throughout the conference. Our ESCP values are ESCP. It's an acronym. E is excellence. For European and global excellence, everyone attending this conference, students, graduates, and speakers, are the perfect representations of academic and business excellence. S for singularity. Our Pan-European Business School is a very singular one, as Anna mentioned, thanks to our unique 6-campus model. And each of your schools is unique as well. C for creativity. As you may know, Professor Jean-Baptiste Say, one of our founders, coined the term entrepreneurs. So the term entrepreneurs, contrary to the President of the United States, Bush, said it's a French term. Sorry to say that. And ESCP Europe Startup Incubators is among the many partners of these events. P is for plurality. We welcome each year 6,000 students coming from 120 countries. And today, we are very proud to see plurality in the nationalities and profiles of your attendees. More than 40 prestigious global business schools are represented. Congratulations for that. Our mission is to educate tomorrow's business leaders. There is no better place than the GBC to illustrate this. Through the various conferences and workshops you will take part in, your insights and your experiences, we hope that you can gain new perspective on humanistic leaderships. We encourage you to reflect and act on the current issues. We hope that also take this opportunity not only to expand your network, but also to bond together. Situational intelligence, intercultural intelligence are a highly sought quality, and we hope you make the most of it. Now I will leave the floor to Jim, our distinguished keynote speaker, Kenneth Cukier, senior editor, digital product at The Economist. Kenneth, we thank you for coming all the way from New York to our beautiful school. We are very honored to receive you. I wish you a wonderful conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have to confess, I'm extremely nervous right now. You're making it worse. I'm nervous because there's videos associated with my slides. Let's see how that goes. Let's try that again. Okay. Good morning. I'm extremely nervous for good reason. Okay, so videos. Let's see how that works. But more importantly, I've got bad news for you, worse news for you. And that is that you've come all the way here. It seems like it's sort of a day off in which you can think great thoughts. And sadly, the first speaker says, it's a test. Okay, you thought you were done with it. You're not. Okay, a test. And the test is this. What if, as a young executive, as a business person, dealing with all the matters that you have to deal with as a young business person, making decisions, examining the facts, analyzing the world, trying to do your best for all of your constituents, all of your stakeholders, all of your shareholders, all of your colleagues, all of your employees, and then something happens that you didn't expect. And it puts an affront to your values, and you're not quite sure where you stand anymore. All that you were working for seems to be thrown asunder. What do you do? Well, that was what The Economist, in some ways, was facing. And here is what we did. This is a video.
For 175 years, The Economist has been doing more than reporting news. It's been championing values, promoting open societies, challenging special interests, making the case for decisions based on cold, hard facts. We set the agenda for free trade and globalization. We made the case for same-sex marriage and private space exploration. But in an age of populism, these values are in jeopardy. So we've begun Open Future, a global conversation with critics and supporters on the vital issues of today. From free trade and free speech to immigration, diversity, and technology. It's a conversation we began in 1843 when we argued against tariffs on grain, and continued with other causes like prison reform and ending slavery. We've led the debate on drug legalization and on regulating the titans of tech. Now it's time to shape the agenda for the challenges of the 21st century. A discussion will lead through articles, events, and online debates, in contests, films, and podcasts. It's time to renew the mission for an open future.
So who are we? What was that about? Really, The Economist? Like, your grandfather reads The Economist, right? Really? Them? They did that? So it's interesting, because in some ways, the history of ESCP and the history of The Economist are tied together. We're part of a larger narrative, and it's the narrative of liberalism. Not the liberalism that we talk about today in the word and as it's misused today, but something bigger, something greater. It was the spirit of Jean-Baptiste Say. It was the spirit of Gladstone. It was the spirit of countless others whose names will come to me as I get more terrorized with the adrenaline coursing through me. But let me start perhaps with Rupert Pennant-Ray, who was an editor of The Economist in the modern times, a couple decades ago, who once described us not as a newspaper, but a views paper. It's a paper that doesn't simply talk about and report on the world, but tries to go more deeply into looking at how to think about the world. And so although The Economist sometimes has a reputation of being, as Karl Marx once put it, the organ of the European aristocrats of finance, there's more to it than that, right? Because of course Jean-Baptiste Say would be accused of being the same thing as well, but of course he was liberalizing the economy in lots of different ways. One way I try to describe it to some of our colleagues, the younger colleagues, is take the Occupy movement. Imagine there was like a house journal that was created around the Occupy movement, and you'd get a little bit closer to the sense of what animated the original founders of The Economist. Walter Bagehot wasn't the first one, but he was a great liberal in America, in Britain, who was thinking about these issues and was an editor for maybe 25 years, as well as a great author and banker. So in the early 1800s, roughly around the time, about 20 years after you were founded and about 10 years before we were founded, there was movements all across Europe, but particularly in Britain. In Britain it was called the Chartists, and it was really about sort of an emancipation movement of what would be called the working class. But because the Industrial Revolution was just starting out, you didn't really have that term yet. Marx hadn't actually started writing seriously yet. And so it was people who were getting enfranchised in the economy. They weren't serfs, right? But they lacked political rights, and they wanted often just very basic rights. And the economy was the largest sort of weight on them and their freedom. And so but of course, state power was being used to quash them, to quell them, and they weren't getting those rights. The way to think about it at The Economist was when we were founded, and I love this, the political, commercial, agricultural, free trade journal, we'll do anything, right, to sell you a paper. But the idea is, we'll talk about anything. During the railroad mania, we called ourselves the Railway Gazette as well underneath that. True story. But we saw the world as, if you will, quote unquote, a severe contest between intelligence which presses forward and an unworthy, timid ignorance obstructing our progress. And the idea was that in our pages, we were going to militate for principles of liberalism. That was freeing up the economy. It was also freeing up the political sphere as well. And we've been doing that successfully for many years. In fact, taking stances on things far beyond and far earlier than when it was popular to do. So we advocated privatizations in the 60s, and by the time, 20 years later, Margaret Thatcher would sweep to power. She used as a blueprint our articles from a decade before, describing how you would do very basic things. And although the idea of privatizations has been sort of reviled in the public sphere today because it's been mishandled in lots of different ways, particularly in other countries, sort of developing countries. You have to remember that what privatization means is if you have a cell phone, you like privatization, right? Because 25 years ago, literally in like when you were born, in your lifetimes, right, you had one phone system. And there was a classic case, a case that was apt to be in India, where there was a person who, a legislator argued that this was intolerable, it's insufferable that people in India should have to wait between 3 and 5 years to get a telephone in their homes, to which the Minister of Communications jaunted out into the parliament and said, and if you don't like it, you can take your name off the list so that someone else more deserving can take your place. So it wasn't a problem, that was just the way it worked, right? And price, we used to pay per minute. It was privatizations saying that, hey, the state doesn't need to be the entity that switches your telephone calls that gave us some of the bounty that we have today. And of course, there were lots of other causes to which we stood forward. But something happened, of course, in 2016 and 2017 with the rise of Trump and with Brexit. And it was around that time that a former European leader called the editor-in-chief of The Economist and basically said, hey, a lot of the things that we care about is being torn away from us, ways never expected. And we need to have a conversation about this, and we need to have a discussion, think about what's coming up next. And there's not too many organizations in the world who can do that, but you're one of them. Not just to report on what's going on, but to lead that debate. And we took that to heart, a form of doing what we're already doing, but doing it with a bit more deliberation and appreciation for its importance. Sort of mission-driven journalism, value-driven journalism, in an age in which a lot of our values are being questioned. And so the editor wrote what she called a manifesto. It was about a 15-page report at the end of on the anniversary, 175th anniversary of the paper just last September. And here's her describing what she was writing about.
On our cover this week, we celebrate our 175th anniversary, and we issue a manifesto for renewing liberalism. It's been a remarkably successful creed. If you look back over the last 175 years, the progress towards human freedom and prosperity has been extraordinary. But as we mark our 175th anniversary, we feel that the liberal creed is under some considerable attack. In America, extraordinarily, a third of people under 35 years old no longer think it's vital to live in a democracy. And as you look around the world, the rising power, the economy that will be the biggest in the 21st century, is a one-party dictatorship. And so we argue, liberals once again need to become the agitators for reform. And in a 10-page essay, we lay out some ideas for what that reform might look like. We look at what might be the 21st century version of free trade, the cause The Economist was founded to champion. In the late 19th and early 20th century, it was the liberals who were behind much of the educational reforms that prepared people for life in the industrial economy. Now, at the beginning of the 21st century, we need to think what kind of educational reform we need. Then we look at immigration. The benefits of the open society are extraordinarily evident, but nonetheless, people are concerned about the consequences of mass migration. We look at how to make immigration politically sustainable and how to fight back against those nativist nationalists who would close borders. And finally, we look at geopolitics. For the last 75 years, the liberal world order has been underpinned by America's hegemonic power. The systems and structures set up in the wake of World War II were the underpinnings of the longest period of peace that we've seen in many centuries. But that system now, too, is under some considerable threat. You have the rise of China, but you also, more importantly, have an American president, an American administration that seems less willing to play the role that it traditionally did. So we look at how the international system needs to be revamped to sustain liberal ideals and the liberal world order in the 21st century. Liberalism is about fighting against entrenched interests. It's about fighting against rigged systems. It's about dispersing power, dispersing concentrated power. And it's important now that liberals regain that spirit. It's a pretty big to-do list. We certainly don't have all the answers, but we hope to provoke debate by offering ideas. And most importantly, we hope to challenge people, challenge liberals that it is time to think boldly about how to sustain the system that has done so well for the last 200 years, but needs once again to be reinvented for the 21st century.
So what did we do? How did we do that? How did we try to take our values and put it into practice in terms of creating a product that people are going to read, watch, listen to, and make an influence in the world? A lot of this is actually going to be relevant to you as business leaders because you're always going to be challenged in terms of thinking about what do I do day to day to bring in some dosh into the company, fill its coffers, and do right by the business. There is a view that sort of you're a human on Saturday, and well, you're faithful and a decent person on a Sunday. You're a human and a family man on a Saturday, and you're a rapacious carnivore who's going to try to sort of get the best you can out of society and, you know, goddamn the rest Monday through Friday. And of course, that view of how the world works was a very mid-20th century view. There's the lingering sentiment of that still today, but it's really completely fictitious, actually. It was always fictitious, although I think some people were reading off the wrong memo sheet. If you think about it, the trend today is for leaders to understand their role as porous in all those domains. So they're on the boards of nonprofits throughout the week, while they're also a business executive in the company that they're in throughout the week, while they also maintain their individual identities throughout the week as well. And so in the case of, you know, the social sphere, coming out at work was a real big movement because it showed how individuals were able to carry on their identity in the workplace and how the workplace had to accommodate that. You're going to be challenged like that all the time as business people because your company is going to be set up for one thing, and it's not quite clear how you're going to jive it with the geopolitical realities if that foundation changes. And that's what we found at The Economist. We had to look at ourselves after the rise of Trump and Brexit and realize, hey, what we've been doing for the last, you know, certainly 175 years, but more importantly, last decade, last 15 years, talking about the value of connectivity, integration, progress, diversity, tolerance, capitalism, right, and not seeing any contradiction in those terms, because the left embraces one and the right typically embraces the other. We see ourselves as radicals, but radical centrists. How do we actually tie in all of these values and noting that we're kind of losing out there, right? You know, it's not like the best candidate won. It looks like the person who was more of a demagogue won. What happened? What was, you know, were people in Rust Belt states not reading The Economist? How perished the thought? Heaven forbid, right? So what we did in the end is, there's a lot of soul searching and a lot of more engaged work that we're doing. I'll put that aside. In the area of Open Future, this one editorial initiative, we decided to break it down into 5 different themes in terms of borders, markets, society, debate, and progress, which is basically making the case for capitalism and, more importantly, how to fix capitalism. Has it been co-opted, and how do we bring it back to its original intent, which is about the distribution of power, not the concentration of power. Borders, the value of an open world. Open society, about free expression, free exchange of ideas, and tolerance. Open debate, which is, of course, free expression as well. So open society would be maybe more about tolerance and diversity and inclusion. And open progress, the idea of technology as an engine and motor that's beneficial, although we need to not be uncritical of it either. And it's things that we've been writing about in our pages for a while, but now we were going to sort of put a label to it and do much more muscular coverage that was more future focused. One of the things that we did in this, in creating this new editorial initiative, is to think about, well, what do we need to do to marry our business objectives with our editorial objectives? Now, our objectives is to treat the world and its hurly-burly, chaotic nature in an understandable way and present it back to the world that's value-driven and sort of explains it to it that aligns with the views that we believe that we hold, that we need to communicate. But at the same time, we understood that we needed to be relevant to a new generation of readers, and so that was very deliberate that we're going to be using digital platforms to do that. We also realized that we needed to, you know, include them in our coverage and have a debate with our critics and our supporters on both sides of the aisle. Okay? And we did that. The way that I describe it in one of the areas where we're reaching out to commentators or young people and practitioners to write for us as contributors is that we want to be a forum for big ideas on vital issues, We want young leaders, a global tapestry of young leaders with a positive vision of the future. And that's it. If the way I described it internally is I said, you know what, in 30 years, we're going to have a whole cohort of people who are going to become, board directors at nonprofits. They're going to be rising up the executive ranks, taking CEOships at companies. They're going to be winning Nobel Prizes. And I want all of those people around the world to have one thing in common. That 30 years earlier, one of the things that put wind in their sails at the outset of their careers is they wrote for the Economist Open Future. They thought I was crazy, of course. That's one of the things you're going to find as well in business. You're going to come out with this vision, and all of your other colleagues are going to be like, really? What are you talking about? We're going to trust him to do that? But at least that is the intent. That is the ambition that we have. And we're meeting that ambition slowly and surely in small, miniature ways. These are some of our contributors. They don't look like the traditional stereotype of the Economist writer, plump with a Sunday roast at the Reform Club, this grand private gentleman's club on the mall, with his brandy, drooping over his fountain pen, writing some quill that's going to some beautiful manifesto that's going to change the world, and probably would. And so we've also invited other people that don't look like us, don't often sometimes share our values, to actually contribute in our pages as well, or metaphoric pages. will.i.am is one of our contributors. Angelina Jolie is a contributor. Now, we might say, hey, Angela Jolie, she's an actor. What does she really know? For the last 17 years, she's also been a representative of the UNHCR, so she often goes to, in her performances, to locations that are pretty bad zones, and she actually does a lot of humanitarian work, so she's very well suited to write on some of these topics, for example, the refugee crisis. And of course, will.i.am, if somebody thinks will.i.am here is a musician, they don't understand who this guy is. He's an innovator, he's an entrepreneur, he's one of the most thoughtful people alive today. He happened to first express his innovation and his creativity through music as a performer, but he does a lot more than that. And for a person who has millions of followers, the fact that he's talking about data and copyright and intellectual property and how we might, and the economy is pretty extraordinary, right? Okay. And so we also have live events. We bring people together. Sometimes we bring people together who people object to, right? This is Steve Bannon. He used to work at the White House and created he was one of the founders of Breitbart, the alt-right, or I should say now right-wing media organization. And we host these events, these live events, as well as events digitally for the purpose of bringing people together to have a conversation, to have a discussion. It's not to say, hey, this is the right way to do things. We happen to believe in what we believe in, but we're willing to change based on the facts. But what's most important is that we have this conversation. This conversation must take place. So how have we done by doing all of this? It hasn't been bad so far. It turns out that there was a real thirst for the sort of journalism that we could produce that would be much more engaging, that would be much more deliberate, that would be much more value-driven, that would be much more probing of our side, quote unquote, as much as the other side. And we have credibility to actually host that conversation, in part because we are radicals, but we're radical centrists. We're part of that responsible middle that looks at both sides and says, yeah, that is right but wrong here, it's right here and wrong there. And so far it's been a way that people have often seen the goodwill with which we're hosting this conversation, not the sort of shout down, let me win at all costs approach that you often see in other forums. As an example of that, this is what we produced when we thought about Karl Marx in modern times.
Karl Marx is often described as one of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century. His writings have inspired revolutions and generated centuries of fierce debate. Born in Prussia, now Germany, in May 1818, Marx believed that capitalism, which was in its infancy at the time, had serious flaws. Marx claimed that in pursuit of profit, capitalists would encourage their ideology that work is good, leisure is bad, and material things will make us happy, embracing mass production, depriving workers of job satisfaction, at the same time exploiting the working class. He became involved in the Communist League, a small group of intellectuals who wanted to abolish the class system and spread wealth equally. Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1847 with his benefactor Friedrich Engels, laying out the Marxist vision of a society where wealth is distributed evenly. Property is owned publicly, and education is free for all. But Marx was little known and little read at the time. When he died in 1883, only 11 people attended his funeral. After his death, his ideas flourished. Based on the theory of Marxism came communism, the realization of a stateless society where all are equal. Communism became a global movement, but the utopian ideal of a fair and equal society failed to materialize. Communism tyrannized and impoverished its subjects and slaughtered them in the tens of millions. Today, capitalism dominates the world. But many of Marx's criticisms have never been more relevant. Today, the global disparity between rich and poor is striking. Marx predicted that capitalism would lead to the rich getting richer and the poor staying poor. He was right. He also predicted that capitalism would lead to boom and bust economics. Marx predicted that capitalism would lead to globalization and that a handful of firms would have huge market dominance. However, Marx underestimated the ability of capitalism to make everybody richer by making products much cheaper. Since the 1980s, the number of people in absolute poverty has fallen by about 1 billion. He also got wrong the capacity of capitalism to reform itself by creating welfare states that redistributed wealth through taxation. Although there is a lot to learn from Marx, his solution was far worse than the disease. At the same time, it can't be said that today's capitalism, dominated by immense inequality and financial crises, has triumphed.
Lots of people would be a little bit surprised, and in fact I think ourselves internally would have been a bit surprised to realize that we would be producing a video, first in that style, right? It doesn't seem like it's the Economist that your grandfather read. At the same time, that would pose the question, was Marx right? And come to the conclusion that, yeah, on several things, several points, he was actually quite right. And so that shows the sort of ecumenical nature in which we are putting forward these ideas. So what are the themes and what are we thinking about? When we look at the world today, one of the big problems that we have is, there's many, I mean, obviously we have a trade war going on right now between the United States and China. So the international links that we presumed were going to be making us richer and producing economic development in other countries is actually starting to shrink, and that's a problem. It's coming at the same time in which a lot of companies are sort of seizing larger market shares, and so there's a concentration of power in capitalism. I think the idea of free trade, weirdly, is often misunderstood, right? You have to go back 150 years to really understand what free trade meant. The reason why there was the Chartist movement and the reason why that the Economist was founded was something called the Corn Laws. It sounds so arcane, but it's actually quite important to understand. Corn wasn't corn as we eat it today, maize, right? It was actually wheat, and it was required for bread, and bread was the sustenance of life, right? In Asia, the staple is rice. In Europe, the staple is bread. But people had to pay far higher prices for wheat, particularly in Britain. And why it was so expensive in wheat is because where do you grow wheat? But on large bodies of land. Who owns the land? The landlords. These are the aristocrats. You could imagine that you could actually free up the economy by having imported wheat, but you'd have to allow that by law. That wasn't part of the law, and the reason why was that only the landed gentry, only landlords, could actually serve in parliament, and only sort of the gentry or the well-off people, males, could actually vote at the time. So you really had laws made for and by the landholding class that increased the price of the most basic commodity of life. Okay? I think it was Condorcet who said that the most perfect tax would be a tax on the air, because it's the one tax that no one could avoid paying. Okay? You could fact check that, but I think that's right. In the modern world, you have to do that. On the other hand, free trade was the way in which we could actually lower the price of goods so that people could actually afford living while also expressing themselves and their freedom on all the different spheres, one of them being the economy. Not for nothing did William Gladstone in Britain in the 1800s be called the man who liberated the kitchen table, because at one famous session of Parliament he obliterated the tariffs and duties on hundreds, if not thousands, of different products that people were using all the time, lowering their costs so that they could actually get on with life and do the things that matter to them. And so we have that same challenge today to bring that interconnectivity together so that we can actually get the benefits from it. It's just a matter of human freedom. Should the state be an intermediary between those transactions that would be beneficial? Probably not, unless there's a really good reason why. And then there's open borders and immigration, right? This is such a difficult issue. I mean, it's really tearing Europe apart, it's tearing societies apart, it's tearing families and friendships apart. What are we going to do about it? It's not, I think it's simple to say that one side is right and the other side's wrong, and that's where the debate is today. And that's just not going to fly. I think in both sides you need to really understand what are people worried about, what are the causes of that frustration and anger. I spoke to one parliamentarian in Britain who went to all the right schools and speaks with the most beautiful and charming of accents, and he represents, but because of the strange way that the political system works, he actually has been put on the list and represents a region of the country that actually has been quite badly hurt by deindustrialization and by the poor economy. Because you had open borders, you had first a wave of all of the shops on the high street closing down, and there was just no economic activity in that area. And then you had a trickling in of people from Eastern Europe coming into that area, and then opening up those shops, but with signs that the local population couldn't read, and a lot of chattering inside the shops and around it that they didn't understand. And the people there, they kind of felt like, what's gone on to my community? Like, this used to be our land. Like, I date my family here for hundreds of years, right? And now I'm a stranger, I'm an alien, I'm a foreigner in my own land. This doesn't feel right. Now, my point to him is, all right, what could we have done 15 years ago to manage that better, that we can learn from today, that we better do today, because in 15 years it's going to be worse, right? People aren't having that conversation to say, hey, there's legitimacy on both sides of this issue, and we need to have an honest debate about it and decide, what are we going to do? How are we going to make the case? You know, the Economist makes the case for open borders, fine. How are we going to do it and manage it in a way that everyone can buy into it more or less, right? Finding that sort of centrism, that responsible middle, has been very hard. The Open Society is another example of that. You would think that the most obvious domain of understanding the world is to say that that which is intimate between individuals should be private to them, right? And that the state should do everything it can to step away from those interactions. And if it is going to be there, it's going to be there to protect rights, not to take away rights. That seems obvious to me. I mean, it's like in my DNA. But at the same time, there's a lot of people who have a different DNA and feel like, no, this is bad. It's either bad on moral reasons, it's bad on religious reasons. Is it a psychological illness? This is the living substance of conversations that are happening today in America's Midwest, right? And cosmopolitan people in European capitals might see the world differently, but we have to find a way to share this space, this world together. We're going to have the conversation. Sometimes it's going to be education, right? We're going to have to make the case for freedom and the values of freedom, and that if we uphold the same rules that uphold the freedom of two men or two women to get married is the exact same philosophical principle that enabled Christian Huguenots to live in Paris without getting friggin' slaughtered, right? Or to take Puritans to go to the New World and to be able to first go to Amsterdam and then go to the New World, go to America, to practice their religious beliefs. It was about the state separating itself from that private domain of individual conscience, right? And individual activity, right? And individual association. that case isn't made, and people are blind to the challenges and the fights and the blood that's been slaughtered for centuries gone by to bring us to the world we are today, where we have a state that should be guaranteeing and protecting rights, not actually denying it. Open debate, of course, is a fundamental principle of this. We can't actually even talk about our differences and come to some sort of agreement, as long as the conversation is in good faith, unless we have an open debate. The no platforming movement on its face seems very reasonable, because if there's someone who is saying noxious views, why should you enable that person to come in and speak? And it's even worse because sometimes they don't simply just have their views, but they actually aren't willing to listen either. It's not about a dialogue. It's not about putting forward their ideas to put it into currency and to challenge them and to reconsider it and have this discussion. It's really about my way or the highway. Nevertheless, I think we have to be tolerant of those that have reprehensible views, and we have to give them the ability to say it so that we can understand it, so that we can challenge it, even if they're operating in bad faith. It is so difficult to do, but really it challenges us. If you believe in freedom of speech, you have to agree to believe in protecting the speech of people that you disagree with, that you find noxious, that you find heinous. If not, accept the fact that you don't believe in freedom of speech, right? It's really a challenge to us, not to the other. And finally, the idea of open progress or technology. Technology is a force for good. We're seeing huge gains in the case of artificial intelligence and the great benefits of the technology platforms like Facebook, Google, Twitter. Yet at the same time, they're being challenged. It's true that the large web platforms haven't done such a good job protecting our privacy and protecting the sanctity of our data, and we need to challenge them on that and have a conversation about it. But at the same time, we should be more welcoming of technology rather than as critical as we are, even though we need to remain vigilant. With this, let me give yet another video, and the last one.
Improving lives, increasing connectivity across the world. That's the great promise offered by data-driven technology.
Stop killing our children! Stop killing our children!
But in China, it also promises greater state control and abuse of power.
Stop killing innocent people! Stop killing innocent people!
This is the next groundbreaking development in data-driven technology: facial recognition. And in China, you can already withdraw cash, check in at airports, and pay for goods using just your face. The country is the world's leader in the use of this emerging technology. And China's many artificial intelligence startups are determined to keep it that way in the future. Companies like Yitu,
We're pioneering artificial intelligence research and innovation in the hope of creating a safer, faster, and healthier world.
第一次发现，参加展会可以不必排队。
Yitu is creating the building blocks for a smart city of the future, where facial recognition is part of everyday life. This could even extend to detecting what people are thinking.
人工智能
Facial recognition, they can read people's emotions, and we are actually now working on these innovative demonstrations and technology.
But the Chinese government has plans to use this new biometric technology to cement its authoritarian rule. The country has ambitious plans to develop a vast national surveillance system based on facial recognition. It'll be used to monitor its 1.4 billion citizens in unprecedented ways, with the capability of tracking everything from their emotions to their sexuality. The primary means will be a vast network of CCTV cameras. 170 million are already in place, and an estimated 400 million new ones will be installed over the next 3 years. The authorities insist this program will allow them to improve security for citizens. And if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. But not everyone is convinced.
这个摄像头现在已经是到处等于是无处不在了。
Hong Shenquai is a former magazine editor who was ousted by the government. He feels like he's under constant surveillance.
我最担心的是我个人的所有的行动行为，我都会被监控到，这是非常可怕的一个事情。
Already the authorities are using facial recognition to name and shame citizens, even for minor offences like jaywalking. In Beijing, they're using the technology to prevent people stealing rolls of loo paper from public toilets. And across China, police officers are now trialling sunglasses and body cameras loaded with facial and gesture recognition technology. It's helping them to identify wanted suspects in real time. What worries some people here is that as the technology develops, so too does the capacity for it to be abused.
那么所有的人在这个生活当中都处在严密的监控之下你不能做任何政府不喜欢的事情如果是这样子的话，我个人认为就相当于进入一个极权主义的一个状态，这是一个很恐怖的状态。
Some of those most at risk in this hyper-surveillance future are the ethnic minorities in China. In Xinjiang province, the Chinese government is wary of the separatist threat posed by the Muslim Uyghur population. According to local NGOs, an estimated 1 million Uyghurs are being detained indefinitely in secretive internment camps where some are being subject to abuse. It's been called the largest mass incarceration of a minority population in the world today. The authorities are using facial recognition cameras to scan people's faces before they enter markets. The system alerts authorities if targeted individuals stray 300 meters beyond their home. In the future, the government plans to aggregate even more data and build a predictive policing program that imposes even tighter controls here. Without checks and balances, China will keep finding new ways to violate the human rights of its citizens. What's already happening in Xinjiang is a warning the rest of the world must heed.
Of course, those systems are being trialed in the West as well. And even if in the West we have rule of law to sort of bring in boundaries on how that technology is used, in a new form of capitalism that's emerging, authoritarian capitalism, the world is cleaving into different spheres of influence that look more like the 19th century than it does we thought would be the 21st, in which, just as maybe in the 20th century is the right metaphor, you have the first world, the second world, and what we call the third world. We remember them. The third world were actually technically the non-aligned nations. It was a synonym for lesser developed countries. However, it was non-aligned because they didn't point to Moscow or Washington. The second world was the Soviet sphere. The first world was the US sphere, America, Europe, Japan, Korea. And in the form of authoritarian capitalism, China will be exporting these technologies to lots of other countries. So if you're the head of state in the Congo, this might be a really lovely technology to have. And if the Beijing model of economic development that sort of has authoritarianism married to capitalism produces economic prosperity for people, but doesn't give them individual liberties, or gives them liberties, but not in the political sphere, but in other domains, that might be good enough for those people. I think a lot of us would think like, hey, if you had a child who was dying and couldn't get health care, you would do lots of things and bend your values slightly to see that that child would live. And so as a result, for lots of places that come from very little, there's a great appeal to have the economic prosperity. It speeds things up much more quickly. Will it be durable? We don't know, but in the short term, we do know that we'll see the rise of political power married to technological authoritarianism that will deny people freedoms and rights. So where do we go with this? We're creating an entirely new world. And when we do that, we're seeing entirely new beasts in the landscape for us that don't quite look like what we're expecting to see. At the same time, it seems like there's an affront to progress and to reason and to science and empirical evidence as a way to understand the world. When we do that, it looks like we're sort of trying to make decisions, but we don't have the foundations right. That we're simply trying to explain things and look at things, but we're lacking something more substantial, something about that foundation. Foundation of principles, foundation of values, foundation of rights, foundation of a state that's dedicated to upholding individual rights. But we've been there before. We've had to rethink the universe in lots of different ways, and we've been challenged before as well by our technologies that threaten us and by our own hand. I'm an optimist. I think when I look forward that we're going to be imagining entirely new worlds that we build with our creativity and our ingenuity and our entrepreneurship, a term, as it's already been said, that we can owe to the founder of your institution, Jean-Baptiste Say. I think together we're going to actually be able to share this pale blue planet well, but it's in our hands to make that so. Thank you very much. Now we have a little bit of time. I'd be happy to take some questions. Yeah, please.
I very much enjoy the videos, which then presents the question of the evolution of media. So as a media entity founded in print, what are the views of the Economist and the ways it's going to relate to people in the future? Will you be migrating to a multimedia platform, and how so?
Yeah, what a great question. So several years ago, about a decade ago, the editor-in-chief, the CEO, and a wise gentleman who is part of the editorial department who thinks about digital things, named Tom Standage, they got together and they were trying to define, well, who is the Economist? What are we? What makes us special? How would we create not a silly corporate mission statement, but something just internally for us to sort of identify that this is the target, this is the bullseye. And they came up with a series of features, that we were a trusted filter on world affairs. There was other features as well, but the interesting thing, at the end of the process, they realized nowhere in this did we say that we were a newspaper, right? And we realized at that point that we have to be platform agnostic, that what we're delivering to people, actually what we're delivering to people is a sentiment. It's a feeling of understanding the world. It's more than just a feeling, of course. I think you really do get that as well. But the ground truth isn't as important as the sentiment, as we know from behavioral economics, to actually bring in financing, to bring in money. So we're selling that feeling, but we're selling the ground truth of it as well. And it doesn't matter what the channel is. So if you want to consume our content through print, we got a product for you. If you want audio, we got something for you. If you want to see it skywritten above the clouds of Bermuda, we'll do it for you. It's just a matter of the cost. Now, one of the problems, though, is that, like any institution, and as business people you're going to understand, you're in sort of what Clay Christensen calls the Innovators Dilemma, right? We're so finely tuned, we're at the apex of what we do in one domain for print. How do we make a shift into these other areas, particularly when the economic model for print is so well established, right? And we sort of depend on it. Will this cannibalize it? Is there actually a market here? Now let's look at other media outlets and what they had to deal with. Time and Newsweek seem to be our homologues in the United States, right? In fact, what was interesting is, so first, you've all heard of Time and Newsweek, right? Okay, I can't take that for granted because in some ways they're shells of their former selves. It'd be interesting for you to know that 10 years ago, Time and Newsweek was vast, both of them were vastly larger than The Economist. I'll give, in reference point, Time was apex 5 million readers, I should say subscribers. Newsweek was about 2.5 million subscribers. The Economist was at the time, about a little under, but just say 1 million subscribers, okay? So Time was 5 times larger than us, right? Newsweek was more than twice the size of us. what happened, right? Well, the reason why they had their subscriptions was because they were actually pricing it below cost because they were making up with advertising. By the time advertising got obliterated, the whole industry, because of the internet, because of the financial crisis, by 2008, right, wham, their whole business collapsed. They couldn't sustain it. They weren't profitable anymore. I spoke to the editor of Newsweek at that time, and he said, in 6 quarters, we went from a $30 million profit to a $30 million loss in 6 friggin' quarters. Think about yourselves as a business person, an executive. You're the CEO, or you advise the CEO. What do? Like, you see this coming, you're right in the cusp of it. How do you change your business model, right? So at The Economist, we were lucky. We had always priced it profitably on subscription alone, so it was just a plus, right, above break even for advertising. So when advertising got slammed, we still didn't have to, it was retching to us, but it didn't distort our entire business, and it didn't even put our business into jeopardy, which was critical. So right now, when we look at the world, we see, hey, we can go through all of these different channels, but a lot of them don't make any sense. Yeah, we have Snapchat, but we're not making money off of Snapchat, but we can deliberately say we're doing it for this reason, engaging into this audience, developing a thirst for our content, supporting our brand, et cetera, and that's worthwhile. But there's other platforms that we actually don't go on to. We're making 2 big plays, one in films, as you saw, and you saw a couple logos of sponsors of it. That's important. It looks like an advertisement. So the traditional church and state boundary of control, that's editorial and not from the sponsor, but them putting forward their brand. At the same time, we have podcasting, which is a great way of building loyalty, so it's benefit from a marketing and subscription plus view, but also sort of whets the appetite, hopefully, for a new generation of readers to consume our content as they'd like to. And more importantly, still, the ethos of the journalist, not the business person here. I'm not a business person, I'm a journalist, but I work with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, is if we can take our income from print and go to these other channels to distribute our content that improves the world by putting forward high quality journalism, well, we should do that. That's part of our mission. And if we lose some money on that, that's fine too, right? Because we know that there's greater things than just getting another percentage point in dividend. There's about sort of putting our values on the line. We are founded based on values, right? Not a lot of other companies can say that, but a lot of them can, and we're one of them that can. Yeah. Why don't we go here first and then there, please?
Thanks. So I love the idea that, that the economists are radical centralists, right? And I think centralist or balanced views are sorely missing in, especially, in America, they talk about this polarization, bipartisanship a lot. The question I have is twofold. First of all, what's the incentive for people who are on the edges, right? Who do see themselves as, I consume the media that I only consume. I don't want to hear the opposite view. And I don't want to hear about the contradictions in my beliefs. And so what's the incentive for them to rebuild, to come to the table again, to engage in that debate? And second is, what's the pace that what do you think is the pace that we actually need to be engaging in these conversations in order to really defend the values or to secure them before things get worse, let's say?
So for the pace, it's hard to say. I mean, you would want to say, well, we should do it right away. So I don't think there's any, we don't need to hesitate. I think we're at, it's not like we're watching a crisis ahead of us. I think we're in the crisis, right? I mean,
how quickly can you do it is the real question, because I don't think we can do it fast enough. Like, that's what's terrifying.
Yeah, you can never do it fast enough. Can you evacuate Dunkirk, before the Germans get there? I mean, you can never, it sounds like cliche alert from World War II, but no, you can never do it fast enough. So that can't be the standard. I mean, you just go full throttle ahead when you're in the midst of it. It's strange because I think that, and then the first part of your question was, remind me. It's so difficult. I mean, I think that your realism, or your question belies a realism that is quite difficult to address, because seen that way, it looks fatalistically bad. right? I don't think you mean it that way. I don't think at all. But what is the incentive? Sort of like, I think it's really hard. I don't see an obvious incentive for people. I see an incentive for people on different sides of a polarized issue to come together. I don't see it if they don't have goodwill. And recently I've been in an environment where I've had to interact with some people who have bad will. And I've never really had to do that before. One of the problems of the sort of the post-war order, and I think it was a problem, but there was a benefit too, one of the problems was that right or left, you were still locked arm brothers for the greater good, right? And what that meant is that you could look around in the 1980s and look at the left and the right, or the 1990s, and say there wasn't that much of a difference between left and right. And that was a frustration for people who wanted difference, and they got one brand of cola, and it was this milk toast, an American expression, a sort of bland, sort of left and right was just debating these shades of globalization, not really the essence of it. Today now, you have these people on the extremes, and they don't seem to have an incentive. It's sort of a blood sport for them. In fact, it's not just a combat, it's a sport. They kind of like it. They like the tussle. And that's a problem because the tussle has real consequences for people. I don't obviously see what the incentive is. Again, more cliches, but sometimes they show some truth, is that there were common missions for society in the past. World War II, of course, was a common mission, right? Building a new nation that came from some colonists on the East Coast and bring forward a westward expansion to the West Coast was a common mission. The idea of empire, of having a country that's an island, spread its values and its law and its commerce and its armies to other countries was a mission, a common mission that society was getting around. Religion was a common narrative, and here I'm sort of channeling my inner Yuval Noah Harari, Sapiens and Homo Deus, this sort of common story, this common narrative. Liberalism was one as well. Democracy was one. And we're missing that today. So I don't see an incentive yet. I think we will have one. I hope I think it was, I want to say Walter Scheidel, a political scientist. There's a dyspeptic view that to have a common mission, what you really need is a war, right? If you have some huge calamity, you will have people who understand that everything else just becomes a small sort of trifle, and that this is really existential, and we come together during that time. I hope that's not true. I can't say if it's not or not, but I hope it's not, because that would be quite dispiriting. It would say that we're going to still have a fractured social and political sphere, and the risk of war would be higher. War is a pretty bad thing. Most people don't remember that because not a lot of people alive today have lived through it in the West. Okay. And the pace, that makes, I think the pace, we need to do it, I think, with gusto. I mean, The Economist has turned its editorial mission in that direction. Chatham House, I'm on the board of Chatham House, which is a think tank in Britain on international affairs, is doing something similar as well. It was founded 100 years ago next year precisely to prevent war, right? And it still feels that same mission today.
So I'm going to ask you a question. You kind of alluded to it earlier. I'm going to kind of challenge you on this aspect of radical centrism, because although it sounds very nice and it sounds fantastic, the idea of radical centrism in practice becomes challenging. You just have an ideals that you look up to, and then you find yourself in the middle, and that just happens to be centrist, or is it an active push to the center as things change, so that if the R changes, do you then have to move yourself to always be centered, or is that the case? And then I guess my follow-up question to that would be, when you do have this situation, do you then have a situation? It's not working very well.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
Okay.
If you do have the situation,
I saw Veronique sort of going into spasm, saying, "Oh my God, she needs the mic."
Yeah,
so I apologize.
my bad. How do you prevent false equivalency from radical ideas, because you want to let everyone's voice be heard, being compared to kind of more moderate ideas that are being countered with it, and then equating them as the same? So I guess those are my two questions.
Okay, so centrism, and then how do you avoid equivalence sort of in media? So for centrism, I think we find ourselves there. It's not deliberate whatsoever. it's not that we say, hey, here's the left and the right, here's where we are. I think we ask ourselves, here's where we are, and we notice the world usually doesn't have the same patient, sober, historical view as we do. And we find people who are jutting off in different directions. But we come from a common pool of ideas, which is liberalism, which itself is moderating, and although radical in a way as well. So sometimes I think in some instances, we look like we're radical, right? And that's fine. So I'll give you like maybe the most modern example of that. Several years ago, we wrote an article, and I showed a cover from of the magazine on assisted dying, on the idea that we called it a right to die. Okay. Now, this is a really burning issue in society that's not spoken about, and the media hasn't really acknowledged, but we were one of the first ones to go out there in a very substantial way. Anyone who's been in a situation as a caregiver, as a family or friend of someone who's in a very tragic situation and is walking into the staircase of their final moments knows that there should be a dignity about that. But the law, based on religion, based on lots of other reasonable standards, doesn't allow that to take place, right? And in fact, it would be unlawful you can administer morphine, but you must preserve life if you can, right? For a lot of people, this idea that you should make legal assisted suicide, basically, is radical. I mean, that's outrageous. And frankly, if we had written this 15 years ago, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, our offices probably would have been bombed, right? They would have had a hard time getting in because there was an IRA guy who was trying to bomb it as well. But be that as it may, that's what you do as journalists. Today, it's just simply, I think in some quarters, seems radical, right? But that's fine. I think in time, the world will move to see it as a centrist position, as a reasonable position, right? Legalizing drugs doesn't seem radical today, right? But when we were talking about it, a decade ago, it was definitely a little bit more forward. Gay marriage in the 90s as well, where we had two men on a wedding cake. So our centrism is born, I think, of our values, but it's not deliberately centrist by looking at the world around us. It's really at looking at our first principles and what we think is the right way to manage the world that we need to communicate to others. For equivalence, it's always been a difficult issue in journalism on how you bring in other sides of the story. Again, the benefit of Rupert Pennett's aphorism and way of looking at The Economist as a newspaper, not a newspaper, means we don't have to be shackled by the traditional standards of objective journalism. We don't have to be objective. In fact, that objectivity has always been a myth. Journalism isn't objective, but it can strive for impartiality. We can be impartial. But even then, if we feel that someone is noxious and someone is right, we can say, this is the person with the correct views. This is the person with the views that we find heinous, and here's what they are, right? We always want to be the paper that is willing to bring out views, even those that we disagree with, and pointing out why we disagree with it. Not saying that the person's an idiot. That's not an argument. That's an insult, right? But saying, here's what they believe, and here's why we don't agree with it. But actually, another Rupert Pennet-Ray aphorism was that if the ideal Economist article would be one in which we tell the reader what they need to know, tell them what we think about it, but give them enough information for the educated reader to come to an alternative interpretation on the matter, right? That would be beautiful. That would be fantastic. Journalism doesn't actually do that. I mean, CNN, Fox, not going to happen. Even the New York Times, FT, not going to happen. Partially, it's because they're dailies and don't have the time to do this. It's just not their mission to do that. But that's what we do, right? And so what we're doing actually isn't journalism, right? It's something else. And that's why I think there's such an appeal for it, because it is something special. Yeah, I see two others. Maybe up there first.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. As we think back on your comment earlier about what could we have said 15 years ago to help prevent some of the tensions that we're seeing, it seems like an easier thought experiment in retrospect. Moving forward, how do you see us being able to prepare for the right changes or implementing the right things to say now for the conflicts that we're going to be seeing in the future? How do you see that conversation playing out it feels like we could prepare for 15 different things happening, and there's not the bandwidth for that. So how do you see that narrative happening?
So can you say the question better, because I feel like I'm going to answer it in this sort of wild, discursive way.
That's kind of how I asked it. So
yeah, no, exactly.
Sense.
So I think we're going to be here for a long time. It's great.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So thinking forward to the next 15 years, how do we prepare for interfering now for conflicts to avoid some of the things? Because you mentioned that we should have done that 15 years ago.
I think I do. I think I have an answer for you then, which is I don't have to know substantively what we need to do. I don't even need to know what themes we should put our lens to. Immigration clearly would be one of them, but there'll be others as well. For example, lethal autonomous weapon systems, AI bots, right? But I do know that framing the question as I framed it is probably the right way of doing it. It was born of having dealt with a small little tragedy that I experienced as a journalist. I was the Tokyo correspondent during the Fukushima crisis. And I was always aghast, amazed, terrified that the Japanese authorities were always behind the crisis, always 2 ticks behind. They were always doing on a Thursday what they should have been doing on a Monday. And I remember, keep in mind, this is towards the end of my stay there. I'd been there for about 3, almost 4 years up until that point. So I knew lots of people, lots of Japanese officials, both at the worker bee level as well as at the senior level. And they were always interested in what the what other international people were thinking, particularly the international media, but just other leaders. And so the journalists played a very special role as being sort of an intermediary between both sides, just to sort of get the thinking out. And that's a typical role that we typically play. So not just in our pages, but in the interviews. So I remember having lots of coffees and lunches with them, and I was constantly saying, guys, like, how could you be mishandling it so badly? When you did this, didn't you realize that the second order implications would be this, this, and this, that you'd want to prepare for it by doing that? An example is, if you pour a ton of water on a reactor that has undergone a meltdown, the water is going to be radioactive, and that spill out is going to spill into the Sea of Japan, and it's going to pollute the waters around Japan, and all of the neighboring countries that have fishing operations are going to feel like they've been economically harmed. There is a way that you could create a sea curtain, a little wall, not a seawall per se, but like a curtain that would prevent that exposed water, that contaminated water, from flowing just randomly into the waters, right? But they didn't put that in until far too late. Like, why wouldn't, when you start dumping the water, you do that as well? Like, that's sort of a very classical thing to do. They were always behind. And it's a crisis, I get that, but still, nevertheless, there's got to be some guy whose job is to like think about it, militate for it, and then for it to happen. That view of then asking them until I was hoarse, like, can you not do on Thursday what you should be doing on Monday? Can you think about what Thursday is and start doing on Thursday what you would otherwise do on Saturday? Right? Can you just like get ahead of the crisis, right? And eventually, I think the world learned from that sort of incident on how to handle these situations a little bit better. It's always imperfect. But that framework is what animates me in thinking about we've got Brexit, we've got Trump. What can we do today to prevent worse? Because we know there is something else worse. And I don't have the substance for that. I only have the framework for that. But that's the conversation we should have. And we should, whatever the issue is, that burning crisis issue, ask ourselves that question. What do we need to do today? Like, this happened, it's bad. What do we need to do today to prevent it from getting into a way that we would look badly and we'd wonder, why didn't we do that today? I know we're running out of time, but I see some other questions, so we'll. Great.
Thank you again for taking the time to speak to us today. My question. So my question is kind of related. So I was born in Ethiopia and immigrated to the United States when I was a child, and so I understand the Western idea in terms of development. The questions that I have, the first part is this whole conflict that I see between China and Western world into the influence of the developing world is, from the perspective of the developing world, is the Western society has always come to us with the idea of this is what we're going to do to help you, come along in the process. But however, has yielded a lot of negative situations in the past. And so the Chinese model now becomes way more attractive, and the lack of trust that there exists within that market makes it difficult for Western entities to go in and operate into that. And so my question to you is, how do we change the conversation or the approach from the Western perspective so that you kind of could account for this issue that has existed from the past? And then the second part of my question is, innovation has always been driven by the idea of driving down production costs. And so even in the United States, although it's advertised as immigrants are taking jobs, it's actually an innovation that has taken away a lot of manufacturing jobs, but has also benefited countries like China, bringing in a significant number of people from poverty into middle class. But as innovation continues to go and progress, then it becomes also inefficient for even cheap labor to even be sufficient anymore. It's more of automation. And so for those countries that are developing that would hope to utilize the cheap labor to build themselves up, how do you get them involved in the innovation aspect of development so that, you know, they also can participate?
Okay, both of those are great questions. Let me take the second one first. So as you rightly point out, the economic development model of developing countries has been international trade based on capitalizing either on their resources or on resources either being natural resources or low-cost labor. And if the culprit to, or if the benefit of an enhanced economy is lowering production costs and the culprit is not cheap labor but automation, what are we going to do when that same trend that's been happening in the first or in the West and rich countries is going to happen in developing countries? They're not going to be able to get on the economic development ladder that relies on international trade because they lose their advantage. They still have the natural resources, but they lose their advantage is in low-cost labor. And why that's a serious problem is because, to build on it, is that when you're relying on natural resources, there's a huge concentration of economic power, right? The gains go to just a small handful of people, whoever owns the plantation or owns the mine. And when you are relying on international trade based on the workers, you have to invest in infrastructure, both physical and social. Physical, like roads and bridges, hospitals; social, like rule of law, the internet, education, right? Healthcare as well. And so, and the gains don't only go to the industries that it was intended to serve. So if it's garment workers in Bangladesh, and so you need to have an educated workforce, or it's a factory of some sort, it's not like just those workers get it. When you build a public school, you know, a kid in a slum goes to that school as well, or potentially can, and therefore you can get some sort of economic upward mobility. So the gains become enhanced society-wide. If we lose that economic model, we lose those gains. And we don't have a development model. We don't know yet what a development model would be that would replace the one based on international trade. So if robots stitch as well as garment workers in Bangladesh, and Adidas is making shoes in Germany and not in, say, Thailand, and likewise garments for, et cetera, Zara, this is a huge problem for the world, and the answer is, I don't know what the answer is, right? I know what the problem is, but we don't yet know what it is. I mean, you better come up with it, because like my generation's not going to solve it. So good luck, okay? Okay. So the first question is, we'll help you. I mean, we'll give you some access to capital, we'll give you access to talent, we'll create a good environment for you to do that, right? We'll take the arrows when they fly at you, right? Innovators curse. I think you can do it. The second one, repeat the question, because I didn't fully get it. I mean, it's about the West, and it's about the West's relationship to countries like in Africa in the past, but sharpen it for me.
Yeah, so I guess the question was, again, historically the relationship with the West has been with these developing countries. We're going to bring progress, right, through whatever means, but it usually had been a way of extracting natural resources or other resources those countries had. And so there's a paranoia that kind of almost exists now within those nations. And so they say, instead of working with the West, we'd rather work with China, what we know what we're getting. And so if your goal is to continue, invest within those regions, because that's where demographic changes are positive relative to the West, how do you convince them to take on the societal or these
it's tough. I mean, the appeal, well, part of it is who is the agent? Who is the agent or interlocutor in those developing countries, in Ethiopia, in the Congo, right? If it's university professors and people from civil society and small business people, you might get one answer. If it's politicians or the heads of large companies, you might get a different answer. The West did horrible things in the 19th and 20th centuries in other countries. They spent the second half of after World War II, after the calamity of our own hand against ourselves, a lot of values changed, and we created a huge edifice of international institutions to bring money to those same places, the IMF and the World Bank notably, but there was lots of others as well, as a way of almost trying to sort of not absolve our sins, but actually the value of economic development, sharing prosperity. China's coming in, and that goodwill, as much as it's been tried to be built, means for little because they're going in with just a sweetened honeypot of incentives for certain people, certain industries. I don't see other than sitting down and saying, okay, here was this guy Descartes, and here was this guy named Hobbes and Locke, and because of Montesquieu, we do it this way, so you really should become a liberal rather than a dictator. That's not going to happen, right? So I don't actually know. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, to say that we need sort of self-governance as a principle, both in the economic sphere as expressed through capitalism and the political sphere as expressed through democracy, it's hard to put it out there, right? I mean, I'm talking to one of the most important branding and advertising gurus in the world who's very old and still alive, and I'm pressing him to write a piece on how to rebrand liberalism. How do you make it relevant? How do you make the case for these values in the modern world that's going to be resonant to people? Because just simply sitting down and talking about Thomas Hobbes it just doesn't work, right? So that's why I can frame the issue, but now I'm going to put it out to you, and here's where I'll end, is to do it. Pick up this baton and run. Don't rely on me. Thanks a lot. Thanks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kenneth, for both shifting my perspective and petrifying me before my morning coffee. Okay, everyone, now we're going to take a quick break, about 15 minutes. For those of you that had to quickly drop your croissants and run in here, you can head back out, have a little coffee, have something to eat, and we will resume at, I believe, 10:45-ish.
Great. My pleasure. Good. Thank you. Yeah.